Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here in Edinburgh. As a Glaswegian, of course, I am obliged to disparage Edinburgh. But last night I greatly enjoyed the drinks reception on the battlements of Edinburgh Castle because it taught you all why the Scots invented tweed. And I was the only person wearing tweed and the only person not suffering from hypothermia by the time we went in to dinner. I'm going to begin this morning's proceedings with a talk inspired by Smith, but also by a man who criticized him, Joseph Schumpeter. I'll talk for, I don't know, 40 minutes will probably suffice, and then I've got a tremendously talented and distinguished panel who will come and tell you why I'm wrong in various ways. Should be fun, and I think we can match former Prime Minister Gordon Brown for dynamism and discussion. I was present for the discussion yesterday, and I don't think he said anything at all. Which was very prudent of him. Some of you will have seen the statue of Adam Smith if you've wandered around this fair city, and you probably assume that it was erected shortly after his death. In fact, it's really quite recent, and it's the work of the great Scottish sculptor Sandy Stoddart, along with the companion statue of Hume. I think it's a very healthy thing that at a time when people tear down historic statues in other parts of the world, the Scots are creating new historic statues, presumably for future generations to tear down. I'll explain why future generations might decide to tear down the statue of Adam Smith in the course of what I'm going to say. I want to begin with two Smith quotations. Being an historian rather than an economist, I've actually read The Wealth of Nations. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. And this is an extraordinary passage in Book 1, Chapter 9 about China. China seems to have been long stationary and had probably long ago acquired that full complement of riches which is consistent with the nature of its laws and institutions. But this complement may be much inferior to what, with other laws and institutions, the nature of its soil, climate, and situation might admit of. A country which neglects or despises foreign commerce, and which admits the vessels of foreign nations into one or two of its ports only, cannot transact the same quantity of business which it might do with different laws and institutions. In a country, too, where, though the rich or the owners of large capitals enjoy a good deal of security, the poor or the owners of small capitals enjoy scarce any, but are liable under the pretense of justice to be pillaged and plundered at any time by the inferior mandarins, the quantity of stock employed in all the different branches of business transacted within it can never be equal to what the nature and extent of that business might admit. Smith was right about so much that it's hard to keep track of all the things he was right about. When I was writing a book entitled Civilization, I came across this passage and realized that it encapsulated the argument that I was attempting to make. Smith had already worked it all out in the 1770s. What made China appear economically stationary in the late 18th century, which we know from more recent research it was, stationary in the sense that per capita income wasn't growing at all, but had in fact been shrinking and would continue to shrink into the 19th century, was nothing specific to Chinese culture, nothing specific to the Chinese race, but had to do with China's laws and institutions. Smith's central argument here is that if you change the laws and institutions, and in particular, if you introduced trade, free trade in particular to China, you would have quite different outcomes. You would very likely have rapid growth. Eventually, policy changes in China after the 1970s proved Smith right. It's an astonishingly insightful passage, and it sums up, I think, what came to be the institutional school of economics. It's really a kind of Doug North passage. But as you all know, the theory of moral sentiments, the earlier work, is just as important a contribution by Smith, and so here's another crucial quote. This is from towards the end of the book, part 6, section 2, chapter 2. The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts, without any regard either to the great interest or the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously, and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder. What genius! Smith understands, even before the era of economic planning, even before the great visions of utopia that came along in the 19th century and caused so much havoc in the 20th, that the grand figure of the planner, who imagines himself master of the chessboard of society, will only wreak havoc if he goes against the grain of the motive forces of the individual human chess pieces. It's all there. And that's why when David invited me to come to speak at this conference, I accepted. Because I sometimes feel that we still underestimate the extent of Smith's genius, the profundity of his thinking. It was as if Smith saw modernity coming and realized all the mistakes that we would make in it, and tried, albeit vainly, to warn us against them. So Smith was right about the invisible hand, right about the market, but also right about the way in which civil society operates, the way we relate to one another through what we now call empathy, but he called sympathy. Why then did, in the mid-20th century, Joseph Schumpeter express such pessimistic views about the future of what one might call a Smithian order? If you read Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which he wrote between 1938 and 1942, you realize how deeply pessimistic Schumpeter was about those things that Smith held dear. Can capitalism survive? Schumpeter asked. No, I do not think it can. Can socialism work? Of course it can. Schumpeter made 4 points about why he thought this. One is very famous, that capitalism operates on the basis of creative destruction, a good thing, but a highly disruptive one, and therefore potentially a source of resistance. Secondly, he made a point familiar since Marx's work, that capitalism tends towards monopoly and corporatism, not competition. Thirdly, he made the very correct observation that capitalism creates, educates, and subsidizes a vested interest in social unrest, namely intellectuals. And finally, Schumpeter argued, socialism is politically irresistible, both to bureaucrats and democratic politicians. And this was why Schumpeter was pessimistic about what lay ahead in the post-Second World War world, and anticipated that socialism would win and capitalism would lose. These are not bad points. as you'll see, we may find ourselves revisiting these arguments if, as I'm going to argue, socialism is making a comeback. I've already made one jibe at the economics profession. Here's another. The most influential textbook of macroeconomics, the one I was told to read when I was an undergraduate at Oxford in the 1980s, was Paul Samuelson's book. That book consistently and wrongly predicted that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in economic terms at some point in the foreseeable future. In the 1961 edition, Samuelson argued that Soviet gross national product would exceed that of the United States between 1984 and 1997. They pushed back the date of sorpasso to 2002 to 2012 in the 1980 edition. And this chart appeared in successive editions of the book, a book inflicted on generations of innocents in American economics departments. The Soviet economy, Samuelson argued, is proof that contrary to what many skeptics had earlier believed, a socialist command economy can function and even thrive. Samuelson, Schumpeter's pupil and Nobel laureate, cannot have read Adam Smith, or at least not very closely. This was all rubbish. What actually happened was that the Soviet economy, even on a generous purchasing power parity adjusted basis, never got closer than 44% the size of the US economy, and as its growth rate slackened and finally became flat, it fell ever further behind. By 1991, at the end of its existence, its economy was less than a third the size of the United States. And I'm old enough to remember that moment of seeming triumph in 1989, when it appeared that we who had made the argument for free markets, who had made the argument against economic planning, had been vindicated by the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe. If you look at a Google Ngram of references in English language publications to socialism, they fell off a cliff after 1989. And interestingly, discussion of capitalism prior to 2008 also diminished. Remember, capitalism is a term of abuse, not originally Marxist. It was actually a Tory term of abuse in the 19th century. And I urge people who believe in the free market and the principles of Smith not to use the term, because the very use of the term capitalism legitimizes its opposite, socialism. That's why they declined more or less in lockstep after it was clear that socialism was defunct. Back then, in most democracies, in most OECD countries, there was a sustained decline in marginal tax rates, marginal personal income tax rates, and corporate income tax rates, as it became clear that the very high marginal tax rates of the 1960s and 1970s led to suboptimal results in terms of growth. Here again, it seemed as if the argument was being won. And yet a funny thing happened on the way to the present. That was the financial crisis. The financial crisis, which people realized was happening in late 2008, but which obviously had begun somewhat earlier, in early 2007, even late 2006, ought to have been an opportunity for the left to make a comeback, since it very clearly fit into the model of crisis as an inherent feature of capitalism. But in fact, the people who made the left-wing argument that the financial crisis happened, therefore bankers should go to jail, did much worse politically than the people on the populist right who said the financial crisis happened and therefore we should restrict immigration and impose tariffs and do other things along those lines. It's a surprising outcome when you come to think of it that the left did quite badly after 2008. Only really in Greece did the left profit from the crisis. It's only much more recently that the left has begun to make serious signs of political recovery. And what is very striking is that on both sides of the Atlantic, socialism has made a comeback amongst the young. Here are two charts to illustrate the point. The first on the left is American data from earlier this year, and it shows that although most Americans have a more positive reaction to the word capitalism than to the word socialism, by a rough 61 to 39 ratio, that's not true amongst the generation aged between 18 and 24, 61% of whom have a positive reaction to the word socialism, as compared with 58% who have a positive reaction to the word capitalism. What one sees a somewhat similar pattern in the British data. You can see here, in fact, that there's even more anti-capitalist feeling amongst British, younger British voters. And so we find a really quite significant generational polarization going on in at least the English-speaking world, where young people, and this may include your children, don't see a great many representatives of Generation Z in the room, but your children are very probably far more attracted to socialism than you are, and more attracted to socialism than you may realize. So I want to talk about that because it seems to me that we face a really meaningful problem if the next generation, the generation in effect currently at university or of university age, believes that socialism is preferable to capitalism. Let me talk some more about why that matters. In my most recent book, The Square and the Tower, I tried to show how an age of large online social networks would be an age in which extreme ideologies would flourish along with fake news. And there's no doubt in my mind that one can't explain the rise of the populist right and more recently the populist left without reference to technology. Technology is disrupting existing structures of politics, undermining established parties, and creating opportunities for extreme ideologies to spread, especially when the leaders of the populist right and left understand better how to use social media than the centrists, the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. And one only really needs to look at these accounts, the Twitter accounts of Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Jeremy Corbyn, to appreciate that something very remarkable is happening. Boris Johnson has about 600,000 followers on Twitter, which he only joined relatively recently. That's 1% of Donald Trump's number of followers, but it's also substantially less than the 2 million Twitter followers that Jeremy Corbyn has. Corbyn is actually the #1 British politician on social media. So this is, I think, a remarkable phenomenon and not one to be underestimated. By and large, I found that people, particularly in the British media and academia, underestimate the importance of social media as if they still haven't quite learnt the lessons of 2016. Let's try and drill down and understand a bit better what is meant here. Because, of course, it depends what you mean by capitalism. When you ask Americans to express their positive or negative views of small business or entrepreneurs or free enterprise, they're far more positive about those things than they are about capitalism or, for that matter, big business. And reassuringly, they have an even more negative view of the federal government than of big business. And as a collective, including all age groups, they remain on balance skeptical about socialism. In fact, for that reason, I think it will be pretty disastrous for the Democratic candidate next year if the word socialism can be associated with that person, as I'm almost sure the Trump campaign will endeavor to do, regardless of who the nominee is. So I don't think we should jump to the wrong conclusion here. Much of what is going on here is that the word capitalism simply has negative associations, whereas small business and entrepreneurship don't. Even more interesting is to understand what Generation Z, as the Americans call it, or we'd say Generation Z. It's terribly confusing, so maybe we should probably go with iGen, which I rather prefer. iGen captures the fact that the generation circa 20 years old has grown up with smartphones and grown up with social media. They never had a time of innocence, which at least the millennials did. And they behave, I think, consequently very differently. What do they mean by socialism? Gallup has a bunch of polls about this, trying to get at what Americans understand by socialism. When they ask Democrats, you can see the answers up here: equality, government services, free health care. 13%, which isn't very many, of Democrats think it implies government ownership. I love the fact that 6% think that socialism means being social, including activity on social media. That's actually a relatively low proportion. Amongst young Australians, it's almost twice that. Oh, socialism? I'm on Facebook all the time, mate. The really revealing answer to the question came from AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in an interview with Anderson Cooper. What we have in mind, she said, and what my policies most closely resemble are what we see in the UK, in Norway, in Finland, in Sweden. Aha! So that's socialism for young Americans. This is pretty interesting when you actually go to Sweden, which I assume AOC has not done. Because Sweden is, in fact, a very model of a dynamic market economy. Ranked 9th in the World Economic Forum's competitiveness ranking, just behind the United Kingdom, which is on 8th. 12th in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business League table, and even 19th in the Heritage Foundation's list of economic freedom. So there's a confusion clearly at work here. When young Americans talk about socialism, what they have in mind is some idealized or caricatured version of Scandinavia or Northern Europe, in which things like higher education are free, or healthcare is seemingly free. It really has nothing to do with what seems to me the central notion of socialism, which is the collective ownership of the means of production. That was the defining feature of socialism as an ideology. The argument, which Marx was not the first to make, that you needed to have some public control rather than private control of capital. It seems as if very few young people have that model in mind. It's all rich with irony to idealize Scandinavian socialism when it's in decline, or when, as in Denmark, it's simply metamorphosing into a respectable version of right-wing populism, is, I think, a huge case of lost in transatlantic translation. The reality in Europe is that social democracy, which was the respectable version of socialism that emerged after World War II, is in deep decline in almost every country. In some cases, it faces extinction. So I sense here a great deal of confusion that we need as educators to try to address. Remember, the reason that young people are confused about socialism is that nobody taught them anything about it at university. And if you don't believe me, take a look at the courses that are on offer in the major universities on both sides of the Atlantic. You will find almost nothing on what happened with all the different 20th century experiments with Marxism and its variants. There are precious few courses that might have helped educate AOC when she was at Boston University and cleared up this confusion. shown her that what happened in Scandinavia was, in fact, that the experiment with really large-scale social democratic intrusion in the economy was a failure and had to be abandoned after crises in the 1990s. The correct analysis is that there is a spectrum of redistribution. You can see it in these OECD data on Gini coefficients for the countries that we have data for, mostly OECD countries. What you can see here is, if you just look at the black lines at the top, inequality before taxes and transfers, and then the red inverted triangle, inequality after taxes and transfers, and then redistribution as a percentage. And you rank countries by the extent of redistribution that occurs. There is a spectrum that ranges from Chile and South Korea at the left-hand side of the chart, all the way to Finland and Ireland at the right side of the x-axis. And that is the spectrum from which each democracy gets to choose. You choose through democracy how much redistribution you want to do. And if you don't want to do much, if you essentially want to leave things as they are pre-tax, then you can be Chile. But if you want to make a really big impact and change the distribution, then you can be Ireland or Finland. That's really the discussion that we're having. It's utterly confusing to cast it in terms of socialism and capitalism, because in reality, each of these countries resembles the other in the fundamental institutions that are used to make the redistribution decision. You may think that the United States should move from the left side, here it is just next to Israel and New Zealand, you may think it should move all the way towards Finland and Ireland in terms of redistribution. Make that argument in 2020. Seek to persuade voters that that is the kind of redistribution that you should have in the United States. Good luck. I just have 10 minutes to talk about an entirely different challenge that believers in economic freedom confront today. And that is the challenge that I certainly underestimated in 1989. In 1989, I guess I was guilty of Eurocentrism. I thought that what happened in Berlin, in Gdansk, what happened in Prague, that all of this ultimately mattered more than what happened in Beijing. And we now see that this was a grave error, and that in fact we should have attached more importance to what happened in Beijing than to what happened in all of the Central and East European cities put together. China, which at least purports still to be a socialist country, has produced the biggest economic surprise of our lifetimes. This chart shows China's gross domestic product of a percentage of the US GDP in two different measures, purchasing power parity adjusted and current dollar terms. On the PPP basis, China's already a larger economy than the United States. It overtook it in 2014, according to the IMF's data. On the current dollar basis, it probably will overtake the United States unless there's a drastic change in the growth rates in the two countries in about 10 years' time. Now remember, what differentiates China from the Soviet Union is that China's reformers, beginning with Deng Xiaoping, allowed a private sector to flourish, so to speak, around the core of state-owned enterprises. And so the non-state sector contributes around 2/3 of China's growth and 8/10 of all new jobs. And we heard yesterday from a product of that extraordinary economic revolution, it has been a triumph by almost any measure, except the kind of measure that Smith might have asked us to apply. Unlike Europe, China has been able to build technology companies comparable in size to the big technology companies of the United States. These are not state-owned enterprises, folks. They are extraordinary achievements of Chinese private enterprise. And if you haven't been to Hangzhou or Shenzhen, if you haven't spent time seeing what the Chinese tech sector can do, then you haven't really understood what has happened in the world, particularly what has happened since China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, which created, I think, the foundation for this period of extraordinary innovation. And I think this hasn't been remarked on nearly enough in Western coverage. Under Xi Jinping, China has significantly changed direction. The government's goal has been to beef up the state-owned enterprises. The government has tended to constrain the big tech companies in ways that they complain about when you have lunch or dinner with the leaders. There was a period when, although it's recently changed, it was clear that credit was flowing disproportionately to the state-owned sector, and private sector companies were struggling to satisfy their credit needs at reasonable rates. This is Nick Lardy's recent study on the subject. I want to emphasize that that trend has changed, not least because the government has had a big shock in the last couple of years in terms of its own economic problems. I want to conclude, bringing us back really to Smith, that the key issue here that we need to focus on, and it's a timely thing to focus on given events in Hong Kong, is not so much democracy as the rule of law. The real distinction, it seems to me, between China's system and the system of the United States, or indeed of the European Union, is the fundamental limitation on the rule of law that exists in China. The World Justice Project assigns scores for different measures of legal order, the efficiency of the criminal justice system, regulatory enforcement, and so forth. And if you compare the United States and China, here the United States is orange, China's in blue, only by the measure of order and security is China ahead of the United States. By all the measures that we probably attach more importance to in the West, fundamental rights, openness of government, absence of corruption, and so forth, China is significantly behind the United States. I included Sweden in this chart just as a reminder that the United States long ago ceased to be the gold standard for rule of law. It's actually, by almost every measure, inferior to the North European democracies. But that, I think, should only emphasize the point. What matters in the end is not whether you're socialist or capitalist. That, I think, has become a false dichotomy. What really matters is whether you have the rule of law or not. China has indeed succeeded, as every politician says in every speech, I'm kind of bored of it now, in pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and this is the greatest achievement in human history. Yes. But those people who have been pulled out of poverty and have become middle class in the last 30 years in China find that they do not have property rights in the way that we understand them in the West, nor can they allocate their capital freely as they would if they lived in the West. And that is why the entire Chinese system exists behind not just a great firewall to exclude foreign internet content, it also exists behind a firewall of capital controls, which, were they to be removed, would allow a vast outflow of capital from China to the rest of the world as China's middle class and upper middle class sought to differentiate, or diversify rather, their portfolios. That seems to me one of the most glaring illustrations of the fundamental weakness of the Chinese system. We as educators need to explain more than we have done in the past 30 years the connection historically from socialism to lawlessness. What is happening in Venezuela today was not hard to predict. Indeed, I remember predicting it when I visited Venezuela while writing Civilization 10 years ago. And yet so many of the Hollywood socialist types defended Hugo Chavez's regime. So too did Jeremy Corbyn, glamorized it even as it hollowed out the rule of law and set that country on a course to disaster. Socialism with Chinese characteristics has absolutely classic characteristics when it comes to the rule of law. And if you don't believe me, look at these photographs of the so-called re-education camps that have been created for China's Muslim Uyghur minority population, or reflect on what is happening in Hong Kong these days. Socialism is fundamentally about absence of rule of law. Once it crosses that line from social democracy to true socialism, where the means of production must be controlled by the state, and where the planner that Smith mocked in the theory of moral sentiments becomes so powerful that he or she almost inevitably perpetrates injustice. The reality that this model produces corruption as well as abuses of power is a reality we cannot emphasize enough when we try to teach people the history of the last 200 years. Let's not forget also, at a time when the young see saving the planet as integral to their new political ideology, that the countries doing the least to save the planet right now include China, and the country that's making the biggest reductions in CO2 emissions, according to the most recent BP data, is the United States. This is an inconvenient truth for those people who want a narrative of socialism that is green. Let me conclude and then invite my colleagues up on the stage to discuss this with another Smith quote. It strikes me that we'll look back in about 10 years on a political crisis in China, but more also on an environmental crisis that affects Asia much more than it affects North America. And we'll wonder why we didn't spend enough time discussing the asymmetrical outcomes of climate change, why we acted as if the planet would all, as it were, be affected equally. Smith thought about what a disaster in China would mean to people in his native Scotland in the theory of moral sentiments. Let us suppose that the great empire of China was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake, and let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe who had no sort of connection with that part of the world would be affected upon receiving intelligence of this dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into many reasonings concerning the effects which the disaster might produce upon the commerce of Europe and the trade and business of the world in general. And when all this fine philosophy was over, when all these humane sentiments had been once fairly expressed, he would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion with the same ease and tranquility as if no such accident had happened. The most frivolous disaster which could befall himself would occasion a more real disturbance. If he was to lose his little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, Smith was an astonishing thinker and a man with a sense of irony that is clear in that wonderfully Voltairean passage. We, I'm glad to say, have gathered together to celebrate his contribution, to ask ourselves how it applies to our own time. I hope I've persuaded you that it applies very forcefully, not only because Smith was right about the way the economy works, but also because Smith was right about its inseparable relationship to a civil society that must above all rest on law. Thank you very much indeed. And now, it's my great pleasure to invite three extraordinarily distinguished thinkers and also friends of mine to the stage. That doesn't mean they'll be friendly to me, by the way. Please welcome Harold James, Peter Schwartz, and Orville Schell. I don't know quite how to conduct this trial since I'm the accused. So perhaps I'll kind of chair it in the simplest fashion by simply inviting you each to offer some comments, and then we'll have a general discussion. And why don't we begin with Harold and move towards me via Orville and Peter. Harold.
So thanks so much. Can you hear me? Is the microphone working? Yeah. Wonderful. It was a great presentation. I'm very, very happy to be here in this celebration of the thinking and the influence, and also the interpretation of what it means for our life today and in the future of Adam Smith. Neil is an old friend of mine, but he also wanted me to be critical, so let me start by something critical, both of Neil and of Smith. Smith had a view of economic change that was inevitably retrospective. If we think of 1776, the year of the Wealth of Nations, it's also, as the Bank of England banknotes remind you, they used to have on the £20 note Adam Smith, but then there's a note with James Watt and Matthew Boulton. So 1776 was the year of the perfection of the steam engine, as well as the year of the Declaration of American Independence. And the steam engine was absolutely transformative. The application of carbon energy was what really made the world a very, very different place in the middle of the 19th century. And it's absolutely unsurprising that Smith didn't see that, couldn't see that. It was going to take place in the future. So the Wealth of Nations famously begins with the description of the pin factory, the division of labor. The division of labor is a great thing, but it doesn't produce the technical change, which was the change that really revolutionized the world. And I think Neil's discussion suffers from a bit of the same problem. That is that what Neil's presentation this morning didn't reflect on was how the technology, the technological revolution of today, in particular AI, is going to really transform the discussion of socialism, capitalism, and what we do in the future. Let me explain that a little bit. The application of artificial intelligence means that something that was a kind of hopeless and, as Neil correctly pointed out, destructive utopia in the 20th century becomes, in the 21st century, a potential reality. In the 1920s, in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, the economic planners in the Planning Institute in the young Soviet Union, Gosplan, worked out what they thought was a model of the economy. And they had something like 600 or 700 simultaneous equations that they needed to solve. They couldn't work out how to solve them. The technology wasn't there. But the application of the the computer power of today and the thinking computer power of today means that those pieces of chess on the chessboard that Neil was thinking about in his metaphor, those can actually be thought of and programmed. And so instead of having an incapacity of the planner, we have, both in the corporate world and in the state world, institutions that actually reflect and project and anticipate and tell us what to do. So when we use Amazon, it's a famous thing. The Amazon comes up with the suggestions of what you might like to have. And this kind of artificial intelligence is going to be applied much, much more radically in the Chinese setting. And that's exactly the way in which the Chinese model, it seems to me, is likely to develop. It's likely to, for instance, use your use of social networks as a way of indicating what you might like to do, what you will do, what you shouldn't do, what would be dangerous to you. So it's a vision of complete control. It needn't necessarily be by a government organization. It can be by a private corporation as well. But it's a vision of complete control that produces a planning that in the 21st century is realistic, whereas the planning of the 20th century was unrealistic. And to many people, this is frightening. So the question is what we can do about it. There's one term that Neil used briefly in his presentation, put it in what used to be called scare quotes, neoliberalism. And it seems to me, if you look at the discussion of today, almost everybody will tell you neoliberalism has failed, neoliberalism was a disaster, neoliberalism produced the financial crisis. Actually, the concept that lies behind the neoliberal thinking, it developed in the late 1930s. It's usually thought to have been initiated in a seminar colloquium in Paris in 1937, is very Smithian. And it's about the application of rules in order to try to constrain both state power and private power. And both of those are thought of as threatening. Again, think about Smith. Smith is very, I think, very perspicacious on this one. That a lot of the polemic in Smith's work is devoted to an attack on the power, the mixing of politics and economics in the East India Corporation. In the 1930s, the discussion was about the power of big business groups organized in cartels to suppress or manipulate price information. And one of the important, I think, producers of the dynamism of the late 20th century was the application of competition policy, first in the United States, and then by the United States military government in Europe, and then by the success in Germany in the 1950s, extended into the European Economic Community. So competition policy is what the Europeans did best, what the Europeans still do best. And if you want a kind of illustration of how this can really produce a dynamism, a capitalism that produces the goods, think of the long Department of Justice case against IBM through the 1970s. It was a case that was never really resolved, but the consequence of it was that when IBM developed the personal computer, they didn't think that they should bundle the software with the hardware, and so they left software to a small firm, really insignificant little firm called Microsoft. That was it wasn't the consequence of a market decision. It was the consequence of a Department of Justice process against IBM. So thinking about the order and the way in which competition policy is enforced seems to me to be a really, really important part of dealing with the challenge of this world in which we get actually a destruction of the old transparency of prices. For instance, if you do an experiment in this room, if we would all try to work out the price for an airplane fare to New York, it would give us very different answers on our telephones because it would take into account, the algorithms take into account what we've looked for in the past. If they know that I've been looking for flights to New York, they know that I'm pretty desperate to do that, and the price goes up. So there's an intransparency about pricing, which is actually undermining a critical part of the mechanism that Smith thought rightly was essential to the dynamics of a capitalist system. And that's exactly the function of what public policy should be thinking about. It's got a high political element at the moment. You, I think, probably all noticed when President Trump wanted to single out a European figure as the hate figure for the United States, the person who hates the United States more than anybody else in Trump's tweet, was Margareta Vestager, the competition commissioner of the European Union. So competition policy is really going to be at the center of it. If I've got 2 minutes more, one and a half. So just on the question of the fiscal story, I thought very interesting what Neil was saying. But the fiscal story is, I think, also something where we need to get into more details about what exactly is going to be taxed and what is going to be redistributed. So the figures that we saw were stories about income tax. I think if you're thinking about the creation of a society in which people feel more comfortable and also in which the international mobility is allowed, we're going to move more and more away from a society that taxes income to a society that taxes immobile wealth and real estate. And that involves enormous political economy problems in making the transition from those different tax systems. But it's, I think, the challenge of the future. So those areas, competition policy and the actual form of taxation, seem to me to be what the real political issues of the next years will be about. And we should really tackle them in a Smithian sense, but we should also be aware of the way in which technology is really producing an absolutely new kind of challenge. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Harold. Given that we've got half an hour, just over half an hour left, and we want to have some audience participation, I'm going to tax Orville and Peter so that I'm going to give you each 5 minutes, which is unfair, but so is life. Orville.
Well, you know, the first thing that occurs to me is what a beautiful writer Adam Smith is. I mean, what elegance he states his thinking. And, you know, we crave that kind of elegant, well-ordered thought process to make sense out of the world we're in. And, you know, listening to you talk, Neil, I must say my head is just sort of exploding with 1,000 ideas. And I think that's partially because the world is in such a state of disorder now that we hardly know even, we yearn for that good old Cold War days when we know who was on what side. And, you know, we had socialism and capitalism all very clear and, you know, dividing lines and everything was divided up neatly. But that's not true anymore. And I think, Neil, what you were trying to do properly is to try to figure out what is the main contradiction in the world now. And you know, it isn't between socialism and capitalism. We don't even know what socialism means. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is not socialism, it's Leninism. What we have in China today is a system that threw Marx out of the helicopter long ago, and it kept Leninism. And what's Leninism? Well, Neil describes it as a very compromised rule of law element. And this is true. It's emphasizing one-party discipline, rule. How do you make the party ascendant? How do you make it well organized? And how do you make it continue its tenure as the only party ruling the country? It seems to me that this is what you're implying when you say rule of law is really the critical fulcrum here. And I think that what we are sort of grappling with is that very question of where is the primary contradiction in the world today. And I think it is precisely there, between authoritarianism and the only other thing we can say is, you know, liberal democracy. That seems to not quite work anymore either. And so we're groping around for ways to define what's on what side and where do we stand. If capitalism once belonged with democracy and Leninism and Marxism belong together, what's the equation, each side of the equation now? So this is really where I sort of enter into this, trying to make sense out of the world. And I think here China's quite helpful. We used to sort of think rather quaintly that 5-year plans were very retrograde, and then we got a bit nostalgic to think that the Chinese can plan and we can't. And there's a certain truth to that. We got a little bit nostalgic to think that, well, maybe as Neil says, the Chinese have pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty, so they must be doing something right. Maybe we're retrograde. And then we had the 2007 collapse and started self-doubting. So nobody quite knows where to repair and what ideology, what political system, what economic system makes sense. So in a way, I think this is our challenge here today at this conference. What part of capitalism, what part of socialism are worth blending together and keeping? And what does work? I don't know the answer to it, but I hand it over to Peter Schwartz to perhaps illuminate us.
Thank you all. Peter.
Well, yeah, I have to say that it's a great delight for me to be here sitting between two good friends of mine who are both brilliant writers, and I've written not quite as many books as them, and it's painful for me when I read both of them because they're both such brilliant writers. It's painful, the quality of the writing, and I commend both books. I will say that Neil and I have had the privilege of debating before. He began we were debating his book, The War of the World, a brilliant but painful book, that he began by saying, I'm a historian, therefore I talk to dead people, as in Adam Smith. I'm a futurist, and I talk to imaginary friends. So let me bring that perspective. First of all, on China, I do think it is interesting that Mao emphasized late in his life perpetual revolution rather than a kind of Leninist order from the top. He too became, I think, profoundly concerned by the state bureaucracy and the kind of stagnation that was implicit in it, and recognized it and was willing to set loose the forces of chaos, as we heard yesterday from Wang Shen, in a very painful spasm that lasted couple of decades.
It's a little like Donald Trump.
Yeah, we'll get to Trump in a moment. But just as an observation that China also went through its de-institutionalization phase, if you will. Trump and AOC. Well, Trump turned electoral politics into reality TV. That we no longer have a conventional national electoral process. We have a reality TV show with a vote on who did the best job on TV. Voters get to call in, as it were. And the thing about AOC is not her ideology, is she gets that. She, too, is a reality TV star. She's playing reality TV, not conventional electoral politics. And the game has changed in a fundamental way. And if anything, Trump is probably the single biggest force undermining the rule of law in America today, in almost everything that he does. And so if it is really about the rule of law, we are in deep trouble because that is precisely at the heart of Donald Trump's ideology. Law does not matter. My personal choice matters more than anything else. If anything, he is in some sense a Leninist in that regard. So let's be clear about his non-ideology. He has no ideology. It is merely narcissism. The only thing that matters to Donald Trump is Donald Trump. Okay, 3. Something you didn't mention, but where I think there was a kind of ideological error that was made in the thinking of recent years had to do with the fall of the Soviet Union and why it fell. And many conservatives have argued it was the brilliance of Ronald Reagan's national security strategy, the defense buildup, Star Wars, that basically forced them into bankruptcy. Not so. That had a little to do with it. What it had to do with was the internal contradictions of socialism, just as many predicted. And in fact, it was the failure of the Soviet economy that collapsed the Soviet Union. When I was in Shell, we actually looked at the future of the Soviet economy and reached the conclusion that the Soviet Union would be gone by the 1990s. That, in fact, the Berlin Wall will fall by 1990, and there would be no Soviet Union because its economy was in such dire straits. When Kathleen and I went to Moscow in 1987 and met with Gorbachev's staff at the Institute for Strategic Studies, they showed me identical graphs you could lay on top of the graphs we had at Shell that showed precisely the state of the Soviet economy. And when I met with Gorbachev a few years later, he too was shocked because they had been in an act of self-deception. So what collapsed the Soviet Union was precisely what Adam Smith was talking about, not Ronald Reagan's defense buildup. And by focusing on that, we lost the opportunity of that fundamental critique of socialism that was available by giving undue credit to Ronald St. Reagan. Okay. Now, in the US, redistribution is not at all discussed today. The language doesn't exist of redistribution. In fact, even worse today, we are now beginning to talk about things like reparations, which will be, if you want to destroy the Democratic Party, pick up a debate and support reparations for Native Americans, for African Americans, and as we heard the other day, Kamala Harris isn't African American enough, right? So she would not qualify for reparations. The left is in the process of self-destruction in America, as it always does. And finally, I actually want to respond to something that Harold suggested here about the ability of, say, China today to manage a very complex society. I mentioned yesterday that among the things I've had the privilege of doing is writing several films, and one of the films was Minority Report. And I think one of the things that is very evident is that as we've studied complexity, that as you end up with more and more complex societies, they become much less predictable. Professor McDonald from Heriot-Watt has written a recent book on applying complexity theory to strategy. I haven't gotten the book yet, but it must be a really good book. Having said that, the point is simply this, that China is no more controllable than any other society from any central authority. It is very much like Minority Report. They're trying. They've got the surveillance systems. They're applying the AI. They're going fast, and they will have no more success than they had in the past in trying to manage a system that is inherently complex and unpredictable as a result. And that unpredictability of complex systems, the path dependence of it, makes it almost impossible for any central authority to manage a large, dynamic, complex society. I think that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. You, in some ways, took the words out of my mouth. I think you've framed this discussion exactly right. Harold's argument would be that the AI allows totalitarianism and economic planning to work in a way that it didn't in the 20th century, and therefore China will win. And I think Orville is probably the person best qualified on the panel to give an opinion on that. I'm with you, Peter. I think that there's something to be said for revisiting Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, that ultimately the dream which Dostoevsky mocks of a society based on equations, algorithms, timetables, and what he didn't know to call machine learning is bound to be undermined by the human factor, in the sense that I don't think a bourgeois society of the sort that now exists in China can readily submit to totalitarianism 2.0. On the contrary, I'm struck by just how much dissent I encounter in China, particularly from middle-class, educated types. Harold, isn't an antitrust competition policy, which you praised, impossible in the Chinese system? And won't ultimately the Chinese SOEs succumb to some version of the Soviet problem, even if the private sector remains dynamic? It's still a Soviet economic system at heart. And final thought inspired by this discussion, won't we all learn to game the system? I mean, once I know that the price to Berlin is cheaper for Harold than it is for me, I'm like, Harold, could you buy me a ticket to Berlin? Because I totally know Google is going to screw me. And so this is where the Dostoevskian element comes in. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky says, no matter how well planned they make our world, man will reserve the right to be stupid. And it's the sheer bloody-mindedness of Homo sapiens that the planners never quite take into account, and which Smith did take into account. And as you say, Orville, he's a beautiful writer, but he's also alive to our reality as human beings, our utter inability to be chess pieces on somebody else's board. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I want to make sure that the audience has time to jump in. We have 20 minutes for questions. Please make sure that you ask a question. It's one sentence with a question mark at the end. There's a hand raised just down near the front here. Recognize a friend. Yes, right down in the third row, please. Yes, thank you. And we'll just
Here
go from
comes
there.
the mic.
There's a microphone, sir.
I'm going to do 2 or 3 sentences.
You're allowed to.
I am curious that you omitted any mention of corporatism in this discussion, and that you set up a conflict between socialism and I think corporatism has in fact triumphed in almost every part of the world. I think it is as much, if not more, of a threat than socialism or what you call Leninism, precisely because to a considerable degree it does deliver the material goods, and it can also accommodate the rule of law, but yet it is sapping of the human spirit. And I see that as much more of a threat than...
Thanks very much.
I guess that was not a
What I
question.
propose to do is collect a bunch of questions, and then we can sort of wrap as a panel in the final 5 minutes. There's a bunch of hands that's gone up, which is highly encouraging. The microphone, can the microphone get over to the top, my left-hand side? Thanks. And then we'll go to the other side of the room. So get that microphone, the second microphone, and move it towards the gentleman almost immediately opposite over there. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, sir.
For a price of one, just to say that in your talk, there is a capitalism which is evolving and a socialism that for some reason should be as Marx defined it in his view or in your view centuries ago. This shouldn't be the case. I mean, we should allow also the concept of socialism to evolve. And in this context, I see a certain contradiction in what you said about the fact that all the discussions about socialism and what happened with central planning have disappeared from textbooks and from curricula. Had they not disappeared, perhaps some people would have spent some time as to thinking how to combine the best of both systems and or additional systems and come up with something that really works. Because at the moment, central planning doesn't work, and what we are experiencing in the Anglo-Saxon world doesn't work either. So what about this? For this combination, I have written in various places that had we spent 1% of the time that we are spending in analyzing capitalism, in actually trying to identify a different workable system, we might have been in a much better world than we are now.
Thanks very much. So can socialism evolve? Could it have evolved? Reminds me of third way discussions that we used to have back in the 1990s. Yes, sir, you're on next. Can we get you a microphone?
Somebody with the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did say the man directly opposite, so I gave clear instructions, but they weren't followed. So often happens. You see how being an economic planner is impossible? I simply planned for the microphone to be there, and even that didn't work. But you're on next, sir, I guarantee it. Okay. Yes.
In your discussion, I'm reminded of the old saw that on the right everything is a paradox, we just can't understand it. On the left, it's a contradiction, but in the center, it's a dilemma, and we wring our hands. What to do is the question. I think, Orville, you said you didn't know what to do. In the spirit of David Teese's proposal at the beginning that we might have a manifesto at the end of this, the question, as Marx phrased it, it's not to understand the system, it's what to do to change it. Do we have any suggestions as to what to do to actually bring about a change that we would like to see? Because I'm hearing lots of very good discussion about the problems, et cetera, but what the hell do we do about it?
The old question, what is to be done?
That's correct.
Chernyshevsky's question, appropriated by Lenin. Yes, sir.
So I'd just like to offer a comment on the Scandinavian story. I'd like to propose that the Scandinavians and the Social Democrats already in the 50s and 60s, the leading thinkers, did not believe that economists or bureaucrats should run corporations, but that it actually should be managers, and that there was, in fact, private ownership, and in fact, it was basically about redistribution. You know, we could discuss numbers and so forth, but I think redistribution was the key point for the Social Democrats, and access to education and so forth. But already in the 50s and 60s, the Swedish leading thinkers, Danish leading thinkers, and so forth. And then in the 80s, going to your point, Niall, in the 80s, when the Social Democrats are basically voted out in the Scandinavian countries, what you saw was, I think, a center-right coalitions move in. And the first thing they would say, for example, in Denmark, was, we will not challenge the welfare state. That's not what this is about. So I'd like to just propose that. And I think and I appreciate you put Sweden up as a conversation here. We have a lot of US, China, and so forth. But so what was it that was going on in the Nordic countries? And what were the problems there? And what are the problems? But I think we need to be really careful about the characterization of socialism. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We've got 4 questions. I think we can probably take a couple more and then come back to the panel. Not sure quite who's next, but there's a gentleman very close to a microphone.
Very close, yes. Great talks. I love them all. My question is, what happened to Russia? I mean, we're talking about systems and, you know, the rapid development in China from almost nothing to substantial growth. I remain puzzled. I mean, I've consulted with Russian companies, and I still remain puzzled as to why Russia, they have no exports except weapons. I mean, there's no toys, there's no machines, there's no toasters, there's no nothing coming out of Russia. You guys are experts on this kind of stuff. I just want to know more about what happened there and why. I mean, do they need Lenin back?
What happened to Russia? We'll take one more question. Yes, sir.
This question's for Peter, directed towards Neil. Do you agree that the outcomes of climate change will be asymmetrical and have repercussions for the global economic system, therefore?
Thank you very much. Well, I think we'll now come back to the panel. We've had a question about corporatism. Can socialism evolve? What is to be done? What really happened in Scandinavia? What the heck happened to Russia? And what will the symmetrical or asymmetrical consequences of climate change be? What I'll suggest we do is go back in reverse order, starting with Peter, then Orville, then Harold, and I'll offer, if there's any time, a final thought. Peter, take whichever of these questions.
I'll take the last 2, Russia and climate change. Yeah. So climate change, yes, climate change is underway. We are in a period of climate change. Climate change began a long time ago. It is heavily driven by humankind. That is the reality. And so the only question is, can we change the trajectory in the long time, and can we deal with the consequences in the short run? And the consequences will be asymmetrical. They will not be identical everywhere. The reality of climate change is not global warming, but extreme weather in more places more often. And what we've been experiencing in recent weeks is a perfect example of that, of extreme heat. We'll have extreme storms, extreme droughts, extreme floods. All of these will be increasingly common in more places around the world. The places that are most vulnerable are the coastal regions of the world, where we will actually see more rapid sea level rise than most people believe. So there will be whole countries, island countries, that will be extinguished, and many coastal regions, most of Bangladesh will disappear, and about 100 million Bangladeshis will have to leave home without an Amex card, and they won't be welcome very many places. And so this is going to be one of the great humanitarian crises the world ever faces. So I do think it is a fundamental issue. I think it is something that the world has not yet even begun to contend with in terms of the scale of the consequences and its timing. It is not 50 years, it's now. And it will continue to be worsening over the years ahead. The only question is, can we manage the consequences, and can we change the trajectory in the long run? That's climate change.
Russia?
Russia. Well, Russia has become a mafia state. Very sadly, they had a very tragic result after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that tragic result was Boris Yeltsin. And Boris Yeltsin was hopelessly incompetent and created the context for, in fact, the rise of the oligarchs, and literally handed the country to a former KGB agent who then transformed himself into a mafia don and has been running an excellent system for Vladimir Putin. I've had the unhappy privilege of spending time with him, and I've only met one other man like him, which was Hafez Assad, both of whom could have put a bullet through your brain without having to think twice about it. This is a man who is completely ruthless and serves one purpose, and that is himself. That is why there are no exports other than oil and gas, because they've developed nothing else in Russia today. It's why he and Donald Trump get along so well. They are two of a kind.
Thank you, Pete. Orville?
Well, I'm glad the subject of climate change came up, because in a certain way, all of the other things we've been talking about today are epiphenomenal compared to that. That is the crisis that binds us all together and for which we have no remedy. The only remedy, of course, requires that the US and China somehow get together, because after all, they are the two largest carbon emitters in the world, and it is precisely for this reason that the discussion we've been having is so critical, because unless we find a way to dock and have some kind of ability to collaborate, even as we have these antithetical political systems, we have this economic competition, well, then we are not going to find an ability to remedy the climate change question. And indeed, you could look at almost every other global question as well. And that is why I think to analyze what it is that China is today, and also to look very carefully at the United States, what is happening in the United States and populism around the world, is so important, is because it will determine whether these other questions, the global economy, climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, these are the questions which really are bedeviling the world, and in our divided state, we're utterly incapable of dealing with. So I'm glad this question arose, because it is the question that makes all of these other considerations meaningful.
Orville, thank you. Harold, finally?
On the climate change issue, I agree absolutely with Peter, with Orville. This is the key issue. But I would like also to point out that it means that the discussion of what globalization and what globalization's future is like will look completely different, because if you think of it, all the cities that were at the center of globalization were on the waterfront. They were, a long time ago, Venice, sinking completely now, London, New York, Shanghai, Hong Kong. And one of the interesting features of the post-Xi Jinping time is the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is deliberately an attempt to construct a globalization that is land-based and where the center of Asia is drawn into it, as well as the fringes, the maritime fringes of the Eurasian landmass. Great questions. I think we can't really answer them all, except I just wanted to say I absolutely agreed with Amar Bidet's point about corporatism. Absolutely right. That it's planning in corporations, planning in governments, they're similar. And that's really what I meant with the AI story, in the sense, and some people said capitalism has failed or something has failed, but actually, no, it hasn't failed. It's been brilliantly successful. It delivers exactly the kinds of goods that we want. It's very, very successful in that area, but it fails in a different sense. It fails in two different senses, really. One is the story about the climate, and the second is what it does to us as deep human beings. That, I think, is an open question. On Peter's point, what destroyed the Soviet Union, I think it's right that it was partly destroyed by its economic contradictions, but it was partly also destroyed by the inhuman character of it, the fact that it ignored human wishes. And so in that sense, I would put, as it were, the critique of John Paul II as more important than the critique of Ronald Reagan. Thank you.
Let me offer a few concluding reflections at the end of this excellent discussion. I agree, Amar, corporatism is all around. One sees it in Silicon Valley, strangely, almost as much as in Washington. I think the question that every country and corporation will be grappling with is who can keep closest to Smith's principles, in the realization that the further we drift away from them, the further we drift in the direction of enormously powerful quasi-monopolies engaged in surveillance capitalism, the worse for us. And I think Harold was very right to raise that issue of competition. The battle over antitrust, the battle over regulation of the giant tech companies is going to be a hugely important one. One thing that only implicitly came up in the discussion of climate is that the mass migration problem is only going to get worse as a consequence of what you mentioned, Peter. Sweden's interesting because Sweden had a wonderful thing going with quite high levels of redistribution and, as you rightly said, a basically private sector economy. But its model was not well designed to cope with large-scale immigration, and the problems, failures of assimilation that are well known in cities like Malmo are now, I think, generalized problems in many parts of Europe. And I think Europeans ain't seen nothing yet, because large-scale climate change impacts in Africa, in the Middle East, as well as in South Asia, are going to mean ever larger numbers of people trying to get to Europe, much, much larger as a problem than the one that the United States confronts, given the relatively small populations of the Central American countries that are the main source of migrants there. And that's relevant to Russia too. Russia has a larger Muslim proportion of its population than any European country. A really large proportion of recruits to the Russian army now, I forget the exact number, are Muslim. And this is something that it seems to me Putinism can't really easily deal with. So I think one of the big challenges that we probably didn't talk nearly enough about is which systems are best able to cope in an age of mass migration comparable with the 19th century, when, in relative terms, comparable volumes of people moved around the world, not just from Europe to North America, but massive emigration from failing Qing China. I think the United States is much better designed to cope with an era of mass migration, although it does require its Congress to reform its immigration system. We know roughly what a successful immigration system can look like, and we know that the US has the tradition to cope much better than Sweden, much better than the North European welfare state with these sorts of issues. With
my immigrants to America.
Yeah, speaking as a recently minted American, I would say that, wouldn't I? And let me conclude with a final question to which I don't know the answer. Which of these systems we've been discussing is most likely to come up with workable solutions to the problems that we call climate change. Is it really the case that China's totalitarianism 2.0 is going to get this right? It hasn't been getting it right thus far, though I've heard more speeches about green economics in China than I'd like to count. But the emissions story is certainly anything but a good news story. Or will it in fact be the private sector? Will it be competitive, free market economies with multiple firms that arrive at the solutions, the mitigations, the technology solutions that we desperately need? I honestly don't know the answer to this question, and I wish Smith were here to give us the answer, because it's just the kind of problem that he was brilliantly designed to answer. I do know, thinking of what Harold said, that the clear solution to the problem is to have coastal cities with lots of hills. And funnily enough, we are having this meeting in just one such place. So globalization with climate change strikes me as being extremely good news for Scotland. All we need is the next Adam Smith to figure out how best to benefit from it. I want to ask you to join me in thanking this extraordinarily good panel.
We'll be drinking fine Scottish wines.